You know, we're often told there's a natural order to things, a right way for society to be set up. But what if I told you that the entire system we live in, the one we take for granted, is basically a complete invention?
I mean, just take a second and look around. This world of ours, with its countries, its laws, its complex governments, does any of this feel like the default setting for human beings? Was this always the plan?
Because, and this is a wild number to think about, for 98% of the time that Homo sapiens have been walking this planet, none of this existed. Not one king, not one country, not a single constitution.
Yeah, look at this. It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? For almost 300,000 years, we were just winging it. What we call civilization is like the last few minutes of a very, very long movie. It's a recent, kind of fragile experiment. And you know what the most important part of that is? Because we built it, it means we can also change it.
So, let's rewind the tape a bit. Let's go back to a system that absolutely sold itself as permanent, God-given, and natural. The Ancient Regime, a world that looked rock solid on the outside, but was really just a house of cards. Okay, so after the Roman Empire collapsed, Europe was basically chaos. To survive, society made this kind of three-part deal. It was a simple arrangement, really. The nobles fight to protect everyone, the clergy pray for everyone's souls, and the commoners, well, they do all the work to feed everyone. Everybody had a job, everybody had a place. It was an order built entirely for security. But then a glitch appears in the matrix. A crack starts to form in this perfectly rigid system. See, trade had been pretty much dead for centuries, but now it was waking up. And as money starts flowing through the veins of Europe again, it begins to dissolve the very glue holding this old world together. And that crack, it opens the door for a brand new player to walk onto the stage. A character who would eventually get so powerful, they'd tear the whole set down.
So let's meet the bourgeoisie. These weren't your typical nobles with fancy titles and ancient castles. Nope, these were the merchants, the bankers, the entrepreneurs. Their power didn't come from their family name. It came from capital, from money, from ships, from workshops, from all the stuff you need to actually make things and generate wealth.
And right here, this is where the real tension builds. You've got the bourgeoisie bankrolling the whole country, paying for the king's armies and palaces, but they were still treated like second-class citizens. They had all this economic power, but absolutely no political voice and zero social respect. The system told them to stay in their lane. They were about to build a new highway.
The spark that lit this whole powder keg was the Enlightenment. Suddenly, you have these new, incredibly dangerous ideas spreading like wildfire. Ideas that said, hey, maybe power comes from the people, not from God. And, you know, maybe one guy shouldn't have all the power. When you mix a wealthy, angry, and ambitious class with a world-changing philosophy, you get a revolution. So, the old order is toppled. Now, the new bosses, the bourgeoisie, get to remake the world in their own image. And they don't just use new laws, they use iron, coal, and steam. This, of course, brings us to the Industrial Revolution. And this new order was a world of shocking contrasts. On one side, you have incredible wealth, innovation, progress like never before. And on the other side, you see the staggering human cost of that progress. This wasn't some utopia of liberty for all. It was a system that created a brand new class of winners and millions of new losers. And on the losing end of this deal, the proletariat. We're talking about millions of people who are pushed off their land in the countryside and flooded into the cities looking for work. What they found were crowded, filthy slums and grueling 14-hour days in factories that were unbelievably dangerous. They had no rights, no protections. It turns out the very class that promised freedom from kings had just become the new masters. Now, this new industrial machine was incredibly powerful, but it was also incredibly hungry. It had a bottomless appetite for growth, for profit, on a planet that's, well, very much finite. And that hunger was about to drag the entire world into a massive conflict.
The problem was simple, really. The factories were churning out way more stuff than people back home could ever buy, and they needed a constant, cheap supply of raw materials to keep the machines running. The logic was brutal and straightforward. If you can't grow anymore at home, you go and take someone else's home. The solution was imperialism.
So you get this mad dash, this global race between the great industrial powers, Europe, the US, Japan. This famous cartoon just nails it. You see them literally carving up Africa and Asia like it's a dinner cake. This wasn't about exploration. It was a cold, calculated business decision to keep profits climbing. And this global land grab,
It turned these nations into bitter, suspicious rivals. So what happens next? First, leaders start pumping up this aggressive nationalism, telling their people we're the best and they're the enemy. That leads to a massive arms race, with everyone building bigger armies and deadlier weapons. And finally, to feel safe, they all form these complex military alliances. By 1914, Europe wasn't a continent, it was a powder keg just waiting for a match.
And eventually, that match gets lit. The whole world that the bourgeoisie had built, this grand order based on industrial power and imperial greed, was about to shatter into a million pieces.
World War I was not a war like any before it. It was an industrial-scale meat grinder that consumed an entire generation. And when the smoke finally cleared, ancient empires that had dominated the map for centuries, the Russian, the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, they were just gone, wiped clean off the map.
And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, a decade later, the economic engine itself just dies. The Great Depression proved that this supposedly natural order of capitalism was dangerously unstable. With factories silent, banks collapsing, and millions starving, people were absolutely desperate for a new system. Any system that would save them.
So the world is in ruins, and out of that chaos, humanity is faced with basically 3 different doors to the future. Door number 1, which the US took, was to reform capitalism, try to tame it. Door number 2, the Soviet path, was to tear it all down and build a communist state. And door number 3 was fascism, the idea that you could purify the nation through violence and total control.
Now, behind door number 2 stood the Soviet Union. It made this incredibly powerful promise to the world, a modern scientific utopia with no rich and no poor. And it did manage to transform a deeply traditional country into an industrial superpower. But the price for that progress was just terrifying, paid for with authoritarian rule and an astronomical human cost.
After the absolute horror of World War II finally burns out fascism, the dust settles and there are only 2 giants left in the ring. The entire planet was split right down the middle. On one side, you had the capitalist West, led by the United States. On the other, the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. This was the New World Order, a planet divided, setting the stage for the next 45 years of the Cold War.
All of which brings us to a final question, one that connects all this history directly to you. In the shadow of that Cold War, a new, surprisingly prosperous way of life was built, at least in the West. So why is it that most of us today live with a level of comfort and security our grandparents could only dream of? Well, the surprising answer lies in the strange and temporary order that was born from all this chaos.